So, yeah, you mentioned there's obviously this like huge wave that's happened in the public sphere of psychedelics becoming more mainstream, even though they're not quite legal yet everywhere. What is the right way of balancing the sort of respect for, the origins of the medicines and making it more publicly accessible? You're a perfect example where you actually do have access, like you mentioned, if you wanted to in Portland, for example, but you prefer not to. What's the path forward there then?
I think that we can learn a lot from cannabis and the way that cannabis legalization has gone down in the States. Cannabis at this point is a commodity market where it was thrown into the free market, having the choice to have dispensaries and places where you could dispense this medicine, and there could be different brands of this medicine that then compete on the free market. It was a choice. I think that, I'm not going to say it was a bad choice or it was a good choice, but it is the choice that we are left with. And it doesn't necessarily prioritize craft or quality of the medicine itself. And I think that is an important lesson to learn, especially as we move forward in not only decriminalization, but also regulation of these psychedelic substances. Oregon in the last election passed a measure that will allow for the regulation of psilocybin. And the reason why I supported that measure as vocally as I did is because they made the choice to not allow any dispensing of
Mhm.
psilocybin mushrooms. So that means that there's going to be no brands, there's no advertising. And I think that does help to protect the sacredness of the medicine, because you're just keeping it out of capitalism. You're keeping it out of a for-profit sphere.
And to be clear, that means it's only or would only be available in like a medicinal setting, right?
Exactly. But anybody can qualify it for
Mhm.
it. So the only way that you would have access to consuming it is by scheduling an appointment with a licensed facilitator, where you would have like a check-in pre-appointment, and then you would schedule your psilocybin trip, but it would be with a therapist, with a facilitator. You couldn't really take any home, or you couldn't purchase any per se to
So it's a
consume.
parallel right now to how ketamine is offered, though, right? Which is that's it's sort of blowing up in its own way. And there's companies like Field Trip that are administering it in these sort of high end clinics. You can't just grab it and take it home with you. But there's still a huge sort of capitalist angle to that, even though it is restricted and it's not dispensed openly to the public, right?
Yes, yeah. And I think that especially with ketamine, with MDMA, even with LSD, I mean, they have roots in Western culture. And so I think that they will move forward in a modality as Western culture does,
Uh-huh.
which values capitalism. We live in a capitalist society. I think that with psilocybin, with these other, like specifically plant based psychedelics, I think that it is important to create regulation that helps to mitigate that kind of commodity takeover as much as possible. And I also think that it is especially important to listen to Indigenous voices. And so having Indigenous peoples who have worked with this plant before, or who have lineage and legacy in accessing this type of medicine, be part of the decision making here. And I think that was also something that the Measure 109 in Oregon that did move to legalize psilocybin, that it promised, and I hope it keeps good on its
Mhm.
promise, is that it is saving a certain number of seats on this governor appointed board that will, help to draw up the framework of regulation for Indigenous voices specifically. And I think that is an incredibly important piece of all this, is that we again saw this with cannabis, where white people just rushed in with a ton of capital and resources and now is capitalizing on cannabis, whereas there are still many Black and brown people sitting in jail for cannabis crimes. And
Mhm.
so we have a big lesson to learn there with psychedelics and the way that we regulate it.
If you could step into the mind of an Indigenous person who has a voice in this particular issue, like what do you think are the issues that are important to them when it comes to rolling things out in a Western society?
Sure. I would say that while I can't speak, of course, for them, I can
Sure.
definitely speak for me and what kind of I would like to see, which is one, quality of the medicine. So how is it being cultivated? How are those people being compensated for that? And who are the people who are cultivating it? I would also like to discuss and talk about the cost of the service itself. Is this going to be something that is kind of relegated to only the like wealthy class who can
Mhm.
afford these types of services? Will there be subsidies? What does that look like? Same type of deal with who are the licensed facilitators going to be? What do their educational backgrounds need to be before? What kind of training do they need to go through? And how much does that training cost? And then where are we setting up these centers? Are they only going to be in cities, or are we actually going to do some work to make sure that they go into rural communities and rural populations where they are also needed? And I think that is also a thing that I've seen, especially in the rollout of kind of the ketamine and the
Mhm.
MDMA clinics, is that they are really kept to the city centers. And I understand that cities have much more liberal politics. And so there
Mhm.
are certain rural counties that just don't want anything to do with psychedelics. However, I think that we need to make sure that we are providing access to this medicine for people who need it in places that need it. And that includes rural communities that maybe they have food deserts, maybe there are a population that is more disparaged or devastated by the war on drugs, who do have sufficient trauma where they would benefit from access to this. And I think that's also an important consideration to make in the rollout.